Welcome to the final event of the Public Engagement with Science Conference, Defining and Measuring Success. My name is Heather Douglas, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on this final day of the conference. This event has provided rich discussion of a range of modes of public engagement and has helped reveal some of the strengths and challenges that arise with each of them. I want to thank all of our speakers for their willingness to participate in this online event and to share their insight, and all of our audience for their engaging questions and conversations. I also want to thank my team, Megan Halpern, Ellie Lawson, Greg Rogel, and Jared Talley, who've done such an amazing job supporting the event. It really does take a team to make events like this work, and they have done an outstanding job. Thank you as well to the Department of Philosophy, the College of Arts and Letters, and the Center for Interdisciplinarity for their support of this event. And I also want to renew our land acknowledgement by collective acknowledging that the Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize and support and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations and for historic indigenous communities in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who are forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous peoples. So again, welcome to the event. I want to talk a little bit about what this last event's going to look like. We'll close the conference with remarks from Bruce Lewenstein. We'll then open the floor to Q&A from the audience. Do use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. You can also comment on questions and upvote questions for the panelists and for the speaker. Please do follow the community standards for the event found on our website. And if you're going to tweet about the event, do use the hashtag PEWS 2020. Recordings of this event, along with all the others, are found on our YouTube channel, PEWS 2020, which can be linked to from our main website. If you have any technical difficulties, please do email pews2020.tech@gmail.com. Okay. And be sure to join us immediately after the webinar today for a final open reception through Spatial Chat, which really does allow for all the sort of informal conversations you would normally have at a conference. You even can self-organize at the beach or the forest or the campfire. So join us there. It's a lot of fun. But before we do that, I do want to introduce our speaker, Bruce Lewenstein, who is Professor of Science Communication and Chair of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. He has been the editor of the journal Public Understanding of Science. He's been a co-chair of the U.S. National Research Council study, Learning Science in Informal Environments, a presidential fellow at the Chemical Heritage Foundation, where he worked on issues of public engagement, and chair of 2 different AAAS sections on the societal implications of science and engineering and on general interest in science and engineering. So please welcome Bruce Lewenstein to provide comments on all of the events we've had.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that introduction. And let me thank Heather and the other organizers for the invitation to give these closing remarks. As Heather just did, and as a number of our other speakers have done, I want to begin with an acknowledgement that I'm coming to you today from within the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, which are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with both historic and contemporary presence on this land that precedes the establishment of town of Ithaca, Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. Later, I'll come back to the meaning of my giving a land acknowledgement, why it's critical that we not view this just as formulaic, but that it's actually fundamental to, I think, to the topic that we're discussing in this conference. Being the last speaker is both an honor and, frankly, it's always a little bit scary, especially when the meeting is like this one, full of such exciting and incredibly rich and stimulating talks. You never know if there's going to be anyone left. People are already just full. They're also trying to sort out all the great ideas they've had. They've already left to check out of their hotels and to take their taxi. Whoops, let's see, that's not what I wanted to do. To check out of their hotels or take their taxi to the airport. Except, of course, that today nobody's rushing for the airport. But I'm still a bit scared that people may have succumbed to Zoom fatigue. But all right, I'm going to go ahead and give it a try. As a historian of science, I was delighted that this conference on what seems to be a contemporary topic was anchored by Deborah Cohen's fascinating history of public engagement with science between the world wars. For it was both an intricate history of a very specific point in time and a reminder that public engagement is not a new idea, nor in fact is public engagement the only label for the field. For example, yesterday on the stakeholder panel, everyone noted that a lot of practical work in the field never uses the name or the label of public engagement, or they use some other different label. I think it was Den Schneider who described the field using that highly technical descriptor, mushy. Some years ago, when I was at what was then called the Chemical Heritage Foundation, what's now the Science History Institute, I tried to write this wiki entry trying to capture those multiple meanings of public engagement. And I think the first thing that we need to do when we do that is to limit the definition to public engagement with science. There's a huge scholarship on various aspects of public engagement in politics and civic engagement and so forth. Some people trace that discussion back to Rousseau and Hobbes and other Enlightenment thinkers. Some of our speakers in the meeting have referred to those linkages with classic political theory and political thinking. But within the field of public engagement with science, even as recently as a decade ago, many of those who were starting to use the label of public engagement with science weren't very familiar with the overlaps with political theory and political ideas. Instead, many of them conflated the idea of broad public participation in the governance of science, which is the kind of two-way or multi-way conversation that we've been focused on at this meeting, with a more educational understanding of public engagement. The idea that we want people engaged with science, excited by science. My poor kids, they have long known that they are characters in my lectures. That's my youngest son at the Van de Graaff generator. He's now lives in Brooklyn and is a data analyst. And that's my oldest one tinkering at the inventor's workbench. But he exemplifies the kind of engagement, of sort of excitement that many in the scientific community are referring to, because it seemed entirely natural to him that one of the first museums that he took my grandson to was a science museum, where Gideon is clearly very engaged. What the people who are talking about public engagement in this way, many of them come from an educational background. Often they work in school, in museums or other educational settings. And before we focus fully on political engagement, I want to be clear about what the educational engagement entails. There's academic engagement, that is just showing up in the context of informal science learning. This includes coming to the museum or the nature center, not perhaps to learn, but just because that's what your family is doing this weekend. There's behavioral engagement, beyond showing up, but actually participating in the learning activities. So that might be playing with the gizmos at the museum, like my son and grandson were doing. Or it could be looking at the little signs identifying the plants at the botanic garden as you take a walk through. Then there's emotional or affective or psychological engagement. And this may be key to the idea of engagement succeeding, because it's not just participating, but it's actually feeling interested and excited and motivated about participating. And we know from education research that excitement and motivation are the keys to learning, and these are deeply emotional factors. There's cognitive engagement. This is what the emotional factors trigger, actually working with the ideas, paying attention to the content knowledge, something that we sometimes call science literacy, a topic I'll come back to later. And finally, there's a social component to engagement, something that Tina Phillips emphasized in her talk in the Citizen Science panel last weekend. That social interaction is part of what cements the connections between the academic, behavioral, emotional, and cognitive factors. You can see these principles exemplified, for example, in the website of the Association of Science Technology Centers, which defines public engagement in science. And I don't want to get bogged down in the differences between in and with. I imagine the organizing committee spent hours working on that question. They define public engagement in science in terms of connection, firsthand experience, and curiosity. What I find important is that even as we move to thinking about political engagement, we have to keep referring back to some of these educational engagement issues. In yesterday's panel on representative samples, for example, we heard from Karen O'Doherty and others about the psychological dimensions of engagement, the need to think about the many factors that bring people into conversation with the critical social issues that we want the public engagement to address. I won't dwell on it, but there is another kind of engagement. When I was working at the Science History Institute, this other kind of engagement that I identified, I called it institutional engagement. Because when I was writing that entry and I was working at then CHF, now Science History Institute, they have a museum. It's just a block and a half from Independence Hall in Philadelphia. As they like to say, they're air conditioned and they get the people who are walking between the visitor center and Independence Hall. And when I talked with the staff of the museum and with other museums around the country about what they meant by public engagement, they all came back to, we want people engaged with us. Yes, they wanted people to learn. Yes, they wanted people to be entertained, but they also wanted people to return to them. We actually heard about some of that institutional engagement yesterday as several speakers talked about their clients and the organizations they work with, about the importance to those institutions of finding ways of connecting with various constituencies and audiences and publics. I think we heard about it actually in the panel earlier today on cross-border engagement as well. Institutions need public engagement. But let me now turn to the kind of public engagement that we've mostly been addressing, participatory engagement. The idea that the governance of science is enhanced by a kind of broad public participation in conversations about science. And by governance, I mean a range of things: identification of problems that have a science-based component, creating priorities and allocating funds among those competing problems, an explicit identification of the values that should shape the ensuing work, the assessment of the quality of the work that's done. Part of why we have to be specific about what kind of public engagement we mean is that public engagement is a buzzword, as the historian Bernadette Bensel-Vincent has shown. Buzzwords are tools for motivating conversations, but they're also boundary objects, which can take on different meanings for different communities. Sometimes that's useful, such as the use of boundary objects in trading zones that allow different groups to get out of the transaction whatever they need. And those of you who are up on your STS literature are groaning right now at how many academic buzzwords from different authors I just mixed into a single sentence. Sometimes buzzwords are dangerous because those different communities might think they've solved a problem when actually they've gone away with completely different understandings of what they've accomplished. So how did public engagement become a buzzword? And now in my abstract on the conference website, I adopted this creaky old man kind of voice. And I did that because next week, literally next week, will be exactly 40 years since my first professional experience in the public communication of science and technology. It's much too hard to maintain that voice. You'll have to excuse me if I take this moment of 40 years to reflect on how we've come to this moment in thinking in the public engagement conversation. A history that I actually think is relevant to one of the biggest challenges we face in identifying the success that Heather keeps asking us to name. Our current obsession with the idea dates to the 1980s. The scientific community, and I want to emphasize that, the scientific community, was going through one of its periodic paroxysms about public ignorance. That led in 1985 to the Royal Society's report on public understanding of science, commonly known as the Bodmer Report. We sometimes date the origins of the deficit model to that report, although the report was actually somewhat more nuanced. More importantly, the report led to the funding of a series of studies about how publics actually interact with science and technology. Perhaps the most famous of those studies, at least within one segment of the scholarly community, is Brian Wynn's sheep farming study. So since I can't actually see you all, and so I can't find out how many of you actually know about that study, I'll give a two-sentence version just to be sure we're all on the same page. In 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, a radiation cloud floated over Europe. As it passed over the United Kingdom, rain brought contamination from the cloud down onto the sheep farming region in the hills of Western Cumbria, just south of the English-Scottish border. The British government restricted the sale of lamb from those hills, fearing contamination of the meat. But actually, the government response was a mess, and it frequently failed to take into account local knowledge about soils, about topography, about sheep farming technique, about market realities. And Wynn's study showed us that the organized scientific community does not have a monopoly on useful technical information or technical perspectives that are important for addressing some kind of immediate technically based problem. Sheep farmers had important and highly relevant information that exposed fundamental flaws in how the scientists from the government agencies were attacking the problem. Some of these, for example, had to do with the local soil chemistry and the difference between models produced in one part of the country and models there. In the public engagement with science world, that study is an urtext, pointing to the absolute need for engaging communities in scientific governance. But the sheep farming study was just one part of a larger project, ultimately many of which were published in this volume, that also involves studies of how people interact with reproductive medicine, genetic counseling, food exhibitions in museums, and environmental advocacy organizations. And what's more, those studies linked with an even broader movement that was drawing attention to indigenous and traditional knowledge systems, to environmental justice issues, and ultimately, generally, to the other critiques of power held by social, political, and commercial institutions. Indeed, many of the cases that we've heard about in the week of this meeting emerged not from the studies of the 1980s, but actually from the energy of social activism that dates back to the 1950s. But in the world focused on public engagement with science, those studies that were funded as a result of the Bodmer Report are the source of the interest that took off in the mid-1990s. As Bensal Vincent demonstrated when she identified the trend of referring to public engagement with science, it took off, though, as a buzzword, conflating many different aspects of engagement. And thus, as public engagement made it into the mainstream, a lot of times it was taken up by the scientific community that had been the ones to initiate the conversation. And because it was so easily tied to educational engagement, it was often seen as just another way of promoting science. Here's just one example of how the term is used. It's on the website of a research institute in the UK. Why is public engagement in science so important? And why should we be investing in a lot more time, money, and effort into disseminating and communicating the breadth of scientific research we undertake? Now, I don't know about you, but that last sentence sounds pretty deficit modelish to me. Now, the organizers of this conference wanted to be sure that we stayed focused on the more complex definition of public engagement with science. Their call to us explicitly stated, we conceive of engagement as differentiated from the broader category of communication and outreach by the expectation that the public provide some constructive input into the products of the endeavor. Thus, public engagement has to be more than merely learning from scientists or science communicators, with the public independently making meaning from or deploying what they have learned. The process of public engagement must take input from the public that helps build the results of the process. And that's a lovely thought. And it's motivated, as I've said, by a tremendous collection of the thought has stimulated and motivated a tremendous collection of stimulating and exciting papers over the 4 days of the meeting. But if our overall concern is success, then I think we need to recognize that we are operating in a world often governed by the assumptions of the social world of science, where the public engagement of science discussion began, and the assumptions in that world that science is inherently a good. There's a tension here. If science is good, then what is it that public engagement brings? And if public engagement challenges governance, if the public engagement that challenges governance is good, then that challenges the deeply held view that science is good. Again, I'm not talking about the more nuanced understandings of what science is or what public engagement is that people participating in this conference might have. I'm talking about the broad public perception of science and of public engagement. I think that's where the tension is. And we've certainly seen that tension in many of the specific examples we've heard about in the meeting. Community conflicts, agencies that ask for public engagement but don't really want to hear from stakeholders or other actors. I'm learning to not use the word stakeholders. The need for experienced facilitators to manage complex, contentious collaborations. I think that was a major theme indeed of the session that just ended. So when we ask, what is a success? I think we're asking, is public engagement about the quest for doing it better? Then we have to ask, what is it? Is it the science? Is it the engagement process? Is it some particular policy or technical outcome? We also have to define what counts as better. Indeed, I think we have to ask whether better is even relevant. Ultimately, the major issue is power. We've heard it referred to across the conference, in both yesterday's stakeholder panel and today's cross-border panel made it a particular issue to consider. Also, as it happens, one of our meeting co-organizers, Megan Halpern, full disclosure, I was Megan's PhD advisor, and her colleague, Michael O'Rourke, who was also a co-author of one of the posters yesterday, just last week, they published a paper on the issue of power in science communication collaborations. This is an issue we have to grapple with. Why does power matter? We care about real public engagement of the kind that this meeting is focused on because we care about public participation in civic life. For most of us, that means we care about participatory democracy. In that context, talking about public engagement in science implies that we believe it will lead to a stronger democracy, and that part of a stronger democracy is a more democratic, participatory approach to doing science and to governing science. That's a very challenging position to the scientific community. Once you start stating our topic like this, you're making scientists uncomfortable. The Mertonian ideal of a science that is pure and independent of political control, or as Heather might say, value-free, the idea that someone other than scientists might have authority over the practice and institutions of science, that's a deeply threatening idea. We saw that last week in some of the questions that emerged during the citizen science panel, such as Maya Horst's comment about the courage of scientists who get involved in engagement. In the Q&A, Nitya Bhaskaran asked, how do we get faculty, older scientists to see the value in community engagement? In a poster session yesterday with Katie Stouffer and Kirsten Hecht, they noted that many of the experienced herpetologists that Kirsten had interviewed didn't think they needed to learn more about engagement, but neither were they doing more than conveying information in their own outreach. In many of the talks we just heard about cross-border issues, the question of who has authority was a key point of conflict. There's a fundamental disconnect about engagement here when you challenge the authority of scientists. Again, we heard about power yesterday in Eric Kennedy's discussion of the hierarchical the traditional hierarchical organization of disaster management, or in Jen Schneider's explicit naming of power as an issue in relationships between clients and facilitators. In the Q&A, when Heather asked whether engagement always has to be bottom up, both Jen and Shannon Dosmegan talked about needing to be both top down and bottom up, partly for organizational and practical reasons, but partly as an acknowledgement of where power sits. The call for this conference asked us to keep an eye towards defining success and measurements of success. And I think one of the key measures has to be, is it just us, those of us in this virtual room, who value a politically engaged public engagement with science? Does the much larger, more powerful scientific community understand that public engagement isn't just about getting people excited and connected, but that it's a process that fundamentally challenges the social power of the scientific community? Getting to that point would be a measure of success. Now, I have to be careful here. I'm not challenging the reality of a world governed by natural processes that are described by the reliable knowledge that science produces. To challenge science is not to challenge reliable knowledge. It is to challenge the processes and institutions of science, precisely because by doing so, we think we can make the knowledge that is produced more reliable. The challenge that we're making is that we think the multidimensional understanding of engagement that we in this room take for granted will ultimately be better for the world than one in which science claims an independence that we know it doesn't have. If we're interested in success and power, a key issue is that we, the community of scholars and practitioners in STS and social activism and in public communication of science and technology, we are not the ones with power. Ultimately, it's the scientists who have power. One of my graduate students, current graduate students, Becca Harrison, has a quote pinned to the top of her Twitter feed. It's from a 2016 presentation by Mark Largent, a historian of science at our host, MSU. I think he's now a vice provost or something. Mark spoke to scientists. So he was speaking to scientists. You are an intensely privileged group of people. You are revered. You have more cultural, social, economic authority than any other group. You guys are it. You possess the wheel of the largest and most powerful institution that ever existed, modern science. And you also control education systems. Your hand in the economic engine is also substantial. You're it. You're the hegemon. You are the most powerful thing. When you forget that and see yourselves as embattled scientists constantly under fire, I understand that you're being harassed. I understand that you're frustrated, but it's because you have so much power and authority. And that's a really good thing. You have a responsibility. You have to be the adult in the room. As Mark suggests, scientists crave appreciation and support. And they do so because they often do have the most reliable knowledge about issues that face us. Climate change is real. We could make a whole list of topics. Perhaps most immediately, vaccines are incredibly powerful and useful tools for public health, and vaccine acceptance matters. We care. We, all of us, not just the people in this room, but all of us care whether vaccines are safe and effective. And those are largely, but not entirely, technical questions. Why do I say not entirely? Because, as Heather has shown, there's no value-free policy. How do we come to societal agreement about what is safe enough? That requires explicit discussions about values and about how those values might differ in different places and times. A lot of public engagement is about identifying those values and building them into decision-making. Even more critical for public discussion is that we want vaccines to be equitably distributed. And what do we mean by equitably? Are we talking about at a national scale or an international scale? At local scales? Is it more important for my 93-year-old mother who lives in a senior continuing care community to get the vaccine, or for my 2-year-old grandson to get the vaccine, or his parents? Deciding what counts as equitable is not an easy discussion. So on the one hand, we too, and now I mean we in this room, we too want people who appreciate and support vaccines, but on the other hand, we believe that we also need more public discussion. Those of us who believe in public engagement believe that two-way or three-way or multi-way dialogue and somewhat less hubris on the part of the scientific community would be good for achieving agreement on safety, effectiveness, and equitable distribution. But ultimately, many of us do also believe that science, as reliable knowledge, as a process for getting that knowledge, and as a set of institutions to produce that knowledge, has shown the value of vaccines in general and the power, there's that word, they're likely to have to get us through this pandemic. So we want support for science too. This past week, there were two vaccine-related events. So between the first 2 days of this meeting and the second 2 days, there were two vaccine-related events relevant to our discussion of power and support. First, many of the big pharma firms said that they wouldn't release a vaccine until safety had been shown according to the standards that they've used in the past. And second, AstraZeneca halted a trial of an early promising vaccine because of one adverse reaction. As it happens, I captured this screenshot just about an hour ago, and if you look in the upper right, it says that AstraZeneca situation has changed and they're about to restart the trial. But anyway, do we need participatory public engagement with science to explain the AstraZeneca situation, their changing place? This isn't a let's hear from the public and take their concerns into account. That happened years ago as the current safety and regulation regime came into being. The situation now is that finding an adverse effect is a normal part of vaccine development. It's why we're doing all this safety testing. Once we've got the agreed upon standards, then you do need to take your vaccine if you want to get out of this mess without millions of deaths en route to herd immunity, which, by the way, also needs to be explained and probably isn't a participatory issue, although I can guess that some of you might challenge me on that. Yes, good, sensitive communication with creative metaphors and a willingness to engage in conversation may be necessary to explain these things, but that's not the same thing as the participatory engagement in governance that's at the heart of this meeting. So success to many people in the scientific community is about acceptance, not about dialogue. I don't think we can ignore their definition of success. We need to find ways for traditional scientific authority and public engagement with science to coexist. That is one measure of success. I return to Deborah Cohen's opening talk. We've long known that identification of democracy and science isn't as clear as Merton made it. What Debbie showed us is that there are alternative paths. For Merton, linking science and democracy was about protecting the independence of both. But as the actors in Debbie's talk showed, scientists and their institutions are not universally good. So there was a need to harness different forces to make science better, forces such as public engagement with science. But Debbie also showed us that ultimately power won. Of her actors, all of them spent some time in exile, and 2 of them died by suicide. Public engagement in science wasn't entirely successful for them. Now, I don't want to end a keynote address of an exciting conference on that somewhat depressing point. So let me turn finally to a place where I think power dynamics can change, and that's communities. Because I've been struck throughout this conference by the focus on communities rather than on individuals. And that's what brings me back to the land acknowledgement. As I noted, a number of us have included land acknowledgements, but we have to keep those acknowledgements from becoming formulaic. We have to find ways of taking actions that address the injustices of the past. And public engagement, for many of us, is about action, certainly about many of the speakers here. Often, though not always, it's about action to deal with some communal issue, climate change, environmental contamination, again, often with the justice issue embedded, biosecurity, public health, transportation policy, food security. Interestingly, most of these examples are of past or current problems. But Kishore Hari asked a question last week. What do we do about looking forward to issues like autonomous cars or COVID vaccines? We need a capacity to deal with those issues. Hang on to that word, capacity. This is a place where I think we need to return to the issue that consumes the scientific community that traditionally holds the power. And that issue is knowledge. Although we know that the ideal of a science disconnected from social forces is a myth, it's also a myth that's fundamental to the identity of many contemporary researchers. And in that myth, knowledge is what matters. In the classic phrase, knowledge is power. Traditionally, we think of knowledge as something that individuals hold. When communities of scientists and educators and others are concerned about science literacy, they're almost always concerned about the ability of individuals to act based on the kinds of reliable knowledge that science produces. That's why the idea of educational public engagement is so appealing. It's about helping people know things. But in 2016, the US National Academies gave us another alternative. In its report on science literacy, it introduced the language of community science literacy. Communities, it said, can achieve levels of sophistication in science literacy that transcend the knowledge or skills of any individual in the community. And that collective literacy occurs when resources are distributed and organized in such a way that the varying abilities of community members work in concert to contribute to their overall well-being. Well-being, that could be the outcome of action, such as many of the public consultations that we've heard about yesterday and today, or the conservation outcomes that citizen science projects often target. But I'm more interested actually in a slightly different sense of well-being. The idea that knowledge itself is something that is collectively held. In this vision, we aren't just interested in what communities can do. We're interested in what communities know. Knowledge itself is a good. It's a component of well-being. These are several different kinds of community science literacy. I'm not going to go through them all, but let's take just a couple. Let's take a small community, a family, for example. Let's imagine a privileged, intact family with resources for entertainment. We know from studies of family learning that if a family goes to a science museum, each member has a different expertise. But when they go home and they talk about, over the dinner table, about their day, they combine their experiences and the things that they learned. Collectively now, they hold knowledge that transcends what they learned individually. None of them can articulate it all, but in conversation, they can respond to what each other knows. Now, often this collective knowledge can lead to action, perhaps a family decision to recycle more, or to buy a fuel-efficient car, or to change their eating habits. In broader communities, this kind of collective knowledge might be considered distributed knowledge. From Steve Epstein's classic study of AIDS activists, we know that only some of the activists acquired detailed technical knowledge. But they shared that knowledge with their community in ways that allowed it to be combined with other kinds of knowledge, of politics, of organizing, of media strategy, and so on, to lead to powerful changes in AIDS research and indeed in ways of knowing about AIDS. So the distinction I want to draw here is between knowledge and action isn't a perfect one, but I'll ask you to keep your focus on that collective knowledge. By thinking about power, we're led to think about collectives. And thinking about collectives leads us to a different way of thinking about success. Not about the fact that some individuals know more or that some community decisions are made, but success is an enhanced capacity of the collective. Full stop. Success is an enhanced capacity of the collective. It's a capacity for deliberation, a capacity for understanding, a capacity for action. I think this is what Rachel Ankeny meant yesterday when she described her work with communities, even if that work is funded by industry, to ultimately be about helping communities think more deeply about the issues they face. It's the capacity for collective thinking that is success. Community science literacy might be better called community science capacity. Now, a group of us, including Shannon Dosmegan, who presented yesterday, as well as Noah Feinstein at Wisconsin and Raj Pandya of the Thriving Earth Exchange, are working on developing this idea of collective science capacity. Actually, if Shannon is watching right now, she's probably muttering to herself, why isn't Lewenstein working on that stuff I've been sending him instead of giving a talk now? I promise, Shannon, I'll get to it soon. For now, though, I'm conscious that thinking about community science capacity is still not getting us all the way to action. So achieving the goal of the land acknowledgement of activity moving towards justice still needs a lot of work. I bring up these ideas because they illustrate the power, there's that word again, of this workshop. I'm drawing to a final conclusion. I can see Heather beginning to get nervous. I'm drawing to a final conclusion. As I've said, this field, whatever we call it, has come so far in the last 40 years. What we've heard over the last 4 days of talks is how a bunch of different approaches, science communication, public engagement with science, community action, collaborative adaptive management, open science, and other labels I didn't even catch, how they have developed ways of thinking that overlap. And precisely because those fields continue on their own paths, there's a richness to the conversation. We're not all just the same people talking to each other, but a bunch of new people hearing new things, generating new ideas. We're building capacity. Me, I'm seeing the connections between power, public engagement, communities, and collective knowledge. Each of you is making some other set of connections. While we need to do work on getting more scientists to engage, a word I've chosen deliberately, with the insights that we bring, I think we can also just celebrate the richness of our own conversations and the stimulating thoughts about how to proceed. And so that's another way of assessing success. And on that basis, I think this meeting has definitely been a success. Before I end, many years ago, I learned from a senior colleague that one of the responsibilities of the last speaker of a meeting is to use the remarks not only to thank previous presenters, but also to thank the session aides who were restocking the water glasses, handing out the programs, making sure the coffee was set out on the breaks, and so on. Now, I know we're all missing those social interactions, and I suspect there probably would have been a small horde of undergraduates helping out if we'd had the meeting as we'd intended. But I do want to use this moment to thank the organizing committee, Heather Douglas, Megan Halpern, Ellie Lawson, Jared Talley, and Greg Rogel. There have been other people behind the scenes whose names I don't know, especially the closed captioners, and I suspect some other IT people ready to respond on short notice. On behalf of all of us participants, I want to thank all of you for helping us have a successful meeting. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was a wonderful summation of a lot of the themes that have been running through things, and I am so pleased that the conference has been a really positive experience for you and for many of the other speakers and listeners as well. I did want to ask you, I'm going to turn to questions from the audience shortly, but I wanted to ask you a question about the idea of science as an inherent good, especially given the course of science in the 20th century, when it's so patently often is not an inherent good, starting with the chemical weapons in World War I. So I'm wondering whether or not this sort of view of science as either inherent good or value-free is something that when it's pointed out to scientists that clearly this is not the case. Clearly it depends on what science you do and how you do it and who you do it with, is a way in which it might encourage them to do public engagement. Because yes, public engagement involves vulnerability, right? That's part of what happens. But it's so much better than just hoping that what you're doing is good.
So yes, I think that you're right. With both of those, one, A, science is patently not always good. B, having scientists engage in the way that we think about it actually is a way of addressing that. But C, to do that requires vulnerability, requires admitting that this vision you have of yourself as doing good is maybe not completely the way it happens. A colleague of mine, Marcella Follett, who's written about the history of science media in the 20th century, she argued in one of her books that one of the issues is that science likes to present itself as being good, but publics can see that that's just not true, right? For all the examples you just cited. And that's actually where the problem is. It's not that people don't trust scientists or don't trust science, but that they can see that there's a mismatch between what the scientists are saying and what the real world is. And so by engaging, you might be able to for the scientists to learn to take that on board. So I think that that's true, but it's definitely it requires a vulnerability. Again, I come back to the comment that I quoted it, I forget who said it, that it takes a lot of courage. Oh, it was Maya Horst who said it takes a lot of courage for a scientist to truly engage. That's not an easy thing. So I don't want to claim that this is just a simple thing we're asking for, but
Yeah.
I do think it's something that we need to be pushing for.
Yeah, I actually, one of the things that I like about the richness of modes of engagement that this conference shows is that just even deciding how you're going to go about public engagement makes it clear that it's not a simple thing, and that you have to think deeply about what the aims are and the goals are for these sorts of activities. And it shouldn't just be, I want to engage the public. That's sort of,
Yeah.
way too, that's like saying, I want to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a complicated thing. And I think many of us who teach various aspects of science communication or public engagement, that's part of what we're trying to help people do, is learn to think in more precise ways. I mean, I tell people who take my classes, if you take nothing away but the idea of audience, and that you have to change what you're doing for a different audience, then I've been a success in my teaching.
So now I do want to turn things over. I think Megan is here to.
Yes, I'm here.
You.
Yes, so we have a few questions populating. First, from Alberta Joseph Alexander, who says, someone told me yesterday that doing activity does not mean having an impact. How does such a statement shape the future of public engagement?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a key thing. We often think, somebody yesterday made the point of agencies that count how many times they've been mentioned in the media as being, that's when they've been a success. No, what you want to know is what the people who read those stories, what did they think? What meanings did they take away? So when you're doing an activity, you don't just want to count that 50 kids showed up. You want to find out, what did those 50 kids take away? Somebody, I don't remember now, somebody was talking about evaluation. I forget which panel it was in. And they mentioned something. We did this once. It was when I was at the Chemical Heritage Foundation. There was a science festival, and there was some kind of dialogue event at the museum. And we wanted to evaluate it, but we also knew this was an evening drinking event, in a week full of other things. Attempting to find out whether we had changed anybody was hopeless. What we did was, for those people who were willing to leave us their email address, which they didn't have to do, afterwards, a few days later, we sent them an email and we said, did you talk about the event with anybody after you left? It was the only question we asked. And a bunch of them, we got a bunch of people back saying, yes, they did. They talked about it at dinner or at work the next day or something like that. So we were measuring, we were going beyond activity. We were finding out something about what the impact was. And I think we have to do that.
We've got another question from Sophia Gutierrez. Says, one thing I really appreciate from both the panels and this last remarks is the emphasis on power. Coming from a Department of Communication research from the perspective of sociocultural studies, this is actually a critical thing and a research object. But at this moment, I'm getting the impression that this is kind of new in the PEWS field. Could you comment on this?
So this is actually part of what I mean about these different understandings of what public engagement is I think within the STSE side of public engagement, the participatory democracy part of public engagement, the fact that power is involved is like, that's where we start. Don't always name it, but we're just assuming we're challenging various powers. But because public engagement with science is largely part of the science community, and for the science community, that educational public engagement, that getting my grandson excited engagement, is the way they think largely about public engagement. And for them, that's not an issue. I mean, power. What's the power there? That's the power of knowledge, right? So the idea that there's social power involved here is new to many people who are using the language of public engagement, but who I don't think have fully understood the complexity of what that phrase means. So I think what that means is that those of us involved in the kind of public engagement we've been talking about at this meeting, we need to do some engagement with our science colleagues about what engagement means. And we have to be ready to, that means we have to be ready to listen to them too, and take on board some of their concerns. Because remember, that's part of what engagement is. This isn't about us one way telling them what engagement is.
So I can say I've done a little bit this with the International Network of Government Science Advisors, and they are receptive when it gets framed as, I'm not trying to say that we're going to vote on scientific results, because they get super alarmed about that, or that we're going to, you know, just totally ignore expertise, but it's about integrating the concerns and the knowledge of the public with the knowledge of the scientific experts. And then they relax. They sort of, it's like, okay, we're still maintaining the value of inquiry and integrity.
Yeah, I think we do that. And I think part of what's also necessary is to start collecting these examples where public engagement has had a meaningful impact on the knowledge that the scientific community recognizes. So the way that research is conducted, biomedical research, is deeply influenced by the AIDS activists. The way popular epidemiology in toxic, environmental justice issues, that has deeply understood some of the complexities of statistics and what is a meaningful result and so on. And I think that we need to be collecting those as one of the tools for helping have that conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another question from, it's Ty Branch or TY Branch. Yesterday, Mahmoud Farouk at ASU presented examples of participatory engagement in education, edutainment spaces, museums and science centers. How would you characterize the relationship between public engagement for education and public engagement to democratize science?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I because of the way I gave this talk, it sounded like I was mostly being critical of museums and educational engagement. But one of the other things that museums are is that they are relatively neutral public spaces. And therefore they are a place where one can have the kind of open discussion and open forum that is more on that participatory side. And I think a lot of the examples that Mahmoud was giving yesterday are of those kinds of public discussion uses of the museum. One of the things that becomes that's important here, though, is that you can't have those public conversations without some kind base or some knowledge inputs. I don't want to call it a base because that would imply one could measure a level, but there is knowledge, there is stuff that you need to know to have an informed conversation. And museums are also, in addition to being spaces, are often superb at being able to help explain complicated things. And so often a lot of those engagement activities, I know this particularly in the nanotechnology world, where the museum community helped develop some of these public engagement activities, participatory democracy type engagement activities, they were paired with development of exhibitions that were really good at that educational engagement, about getting you excited about nano and explaining nano and helping you understand what nano could achieve and so on. So there can be a very positive collaboration between those, and museums actually happen to be one of the places that are particularly good for that, I think.
So if there are no other questions coming from the rest of the group, I'll ask the question, which is, and actually this is for either of you, but where do we go from here? What comes next?
Oh boy, well, First,
Heather's going to get a drink, I suspect.
I'm gonna get a drink.
If you want off the hook, Eric Kennedy just asked a question, so I can read his instead.
So actually, all attendees and panelists should be expecting a survey in the coming week about next steps, including certain kinds of publication options, but also future collaborations on various topics. I'm super interested in decarbonization energy planning and community engagement and public engagement around decarbonization, energy planning, and energy justice issues. So I will probably be like trying to use some of the insights that we gained from this conference in that sphere. We'll see how that goes. I'll let you know.
Yeah. And I mentioned this community science literacy project we've got, where I think we will be trying to be explicit about power issues. But I can segue now into the question that Eric asked here, which I've just read. I don't know, Megan, if you need to read it out loud or whether everybody's read it.
I can read it out loud in case you can't see it. When we make all the substantive changes that we've talked about here, more meaningful engagement, more consideration of power, taking seriously the heterogeneity of communities, etc., is there a point at which this ultimately morphs into political science or democratic theory? In other words, is public engagement in and of itself able to resolve the underlying questions about how to deal with conflicting constituencies and values? Or is the journey of public engagement ultimately pointing us towards other realms to answer those questions?
So this is one of the places we're going to have to go, is that those of us involved in public engagement with science do have to engage more with conversations about political theory and about political organization. And I don't know that we're going to be able to resolve them. I think we may actually be able to help some of the political theory people by having a different kind of thing, because we're not talking about road building or allocation of political power. We're talking about allocation of a different kind of power, a knowledge power. People who study public opinion about science have found that they are able to contribute to general theory about public opinion because, unlike abortion or party identification, most people don't have a pre-existing opinion about nanotechnology or synthetic biology or autonomous cars. And so by finding out how people come up with opinions about new topics, that actually helps us understand the entire process of public opinion. So part of that general political discussion. And in turn, I think we have things, those of us particularly interested in the science world, have things to learn from those political theories, things that we have not been as good as we should have been at bringing those things in.
Exactly. And I actually think, look, political theory has been struggling among itself for different ways of thinking about participatory and deliberative democracy versus representative democracy. And at this point in time, the political theorists that I'm reading are sort of like, we need all of it. You know, you have to have representative democracy, you have to have participatory democracy. There's no sort of like, you know, sort of one way to do democratic theory and democratic practice. And this reminds me of, you know, John Dewey's work in The Public and Its Problems, 1927, was like, democracy is an ongoing experiment. And all you can do is keep experimenting and keep doing the inquiry of how to do this. It's not going to get done. That's a mistake. And so at this point in time, this conference was in some ways to try to coalesce some ideas around what we're doing and to figure out what the next experiments might be. Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful conference for me to organize and run and have all you part of. So thank you so much.